why don't we get started again? Just because I'm going to got a little bit of ways to go to finish, and I want to leave some time at the end for questions. Quick clarification. Anybody know that? I can't do it. Thank you. Thank you. I want a quick point of clarification. Two people came up to me and were asking me about whether I preferred live release rate to the what I called live release proportion, plus those still in shelter and the euthanasia as a total. I definitely prefer the live release proportion. That is the number of animals that you have released successfully over intake plus those that were still in shelter, because of the limitations I talked about with the live release rate. If you use the live release rate, just understand what it represents and don't misrepresent it to the people who, don't misrepresent it to yourself and don't misrepresent it to people that you are sharing that with, okay? So I'm sorry if I was confusing in that regard. So, quick question. What does an average mean? I know how to calculate it. Take all the observations and divide it by the number of observations. That's the average. What does it convey to you? If I told you that the average age of the people in this audience was 39, what does that mean to you? What is that a measure of?
Most people excluding outliers.
All right, but no, I mean, that average is going to have the outliers, right? If I don't take them out.
It doesn't represent them, though. Like, it's kind of like the average temperature. Like, so yeah, 65 degrees.
So what does it mean? What does it? I mean, we use averages all the time. What do they mean? What does it convey to you? What is it supposed to convey to you? Yeah, standard I could expect. What does it tell you anything about? Let's say I have 4 80-year-olds, but I also have 3 4-year-olds, and the average is somewhere around 30. What's the standard I can expect? I'm pushing you a little bit. It is the standard, but what does it mean? What are you hoping it means?
Well, I would want to know how many 39-year-olds are in the room as opposed to the average of everybody's age group.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be what proportion are, yeah, what proportion?
You're trying to attract more young people to it.
Okay.
Doing an average age doesn't help.
Yeah, all right, good. So, you know what? Statistically speaking, it's supposed to be a measure of what we call central tendency. It's supposed to be that point above which 50% of the people in the room lie, and the point at which 50%, below which 50% of the people. That's what a mean is supposed to represent statistically. Okay? And so if we had data, and this is actually from a shelter we work with, where this is the average length of, this is the length of stay, not the average. This is the length of stay of all animals, all cats that walk through the door in 2010. If I take the average of this, where will the average be? Will it be somewhere kind of up here, somewhere down here? Where will the average be? Any ideas? Actually, I won't belabor this. These extreme values, the ones at the top, generally pull the average upwards when these data are skewed to the right. And so the middle of the data, the middle where 50% of the data are below and 50% of the data below are above, will actually be somewhat more close to where the bulk of the data are. That's called a median. And when you have data, because means were actually developed to be a measure of central tendency if your data had a bell-shaped curve, if they were normally distributed. And the only reason I show this to you is that we get all these averages in our statistical or in our software packages. And in fact, you're not quite sure what they represent, because they aren't necessarily the middle of the data. And what I'm going to show you, the reason I'm taking any time to do this is that the data I'm going to show you are actually done with medians, but I had to do this because it didn't, the software packages don't do this. And I'm going to, so once I'm going to show you the medians, then I'm going to move to averages because that's what you can get. And I think if you consistently follow averages, then you're not going to be too badly misled. And the good news is that averages are usually pulled to the tail. And so they're actually more conservative in a sense. They're telling you that the middle of your data is a little bit higher than it really is. And so if you use it, and for capacity planning and what have you, you're actually going to be less likely to overcrowd your shelters in them. So I'm not suggesting you have to use median. At some point, I'd love the software packages to provide medians because I think there are data in here that are best represented by medians, which is actually, by definition, the middle of the data. So anyway, what I wanted to show you is that once you get median length of stay, you can begin to look at it. And this was a shelter, a no-kill shelter, that you began to accumulate animals. And you could see it, but you couldn't they hadn't quantified it. And at some point around here, we went, oh my goodness, these animals just keep accumulating because our average length of stay is going up and up and up. And so now we're tracking it, and we've actually come down quite a bit and are still tracking on downwards, trying to lower the length of stay in this shelter. Just to show that unweaned animals often can skew, it's nice to divide them up by age group because often your juvenile animals, and especially your unweaned animals, are going to make your average length of stay longer because obviously they've got to grow up and get old enough to put them out. So separating by age group is often a really good idea if you're tracking any of these. This was another shelter where we were trying to drive down what seemed to be one of the bottlenecks, was to trying to get the animals to the adoption floor and tracking these things over time. So there are all kinds of ways that one can drive down the average length of stay. It's really not my objective today to talk about those, but I have put together, Dr. Hurley and Dr. Newberry have done a lot of work with this. They have some nice publications on it, and I've also got more references at the end. So let's also talk next about overcrowding, because that's another one of those factors that really leads to poor welfare, and it's often associated with increasing lengths of time. And we're going to talk about, obviously there are a lot of ways to measure capacity. If you don't have enough parking capacity for your adopters, that's going to discourage adopters. So I'm not talking about parking capacity today. Instead, what I want to talk about is the actual capacity for you to physically house animals in your facility, and also the capacity you have to provide care for them. So one place to start is to start to count the number of what I'm going to call them humane housing units that you have that are available to house animals. That will give you at least your static physical capacity. And this is presumably the number above which you don't want to accumulate more animals. Now, I'm going to assume we're talking about the space within the shelter. You can do a capacity estimate for your foster care. So you, again, keeping your question very specific. How many can I house in my physical plant is what I'm going to talk about. I'm not ignoring foster care. You can do a similar calculation for foster care. So first you're going to count the humane housing units. And by humane housing unit, I don't mean those little less than 2x2 cages for which animals are kept temporarily in, or those that you're using for surgical recovery. I think you need to be honest and say, how many spaces do I have in my facility that I can humanely house animals in for some length of time? And that takes a little bit of work, sometimes a little bit alarming with just that exercise alone. But then the question is, what percentage of that space is full today, and what will happen if I add more animals to that? So here was a shelter we were in very, very recently. And they had 29 humane housing units for their dogs and 50 for their cats, a small no-kill shelter. On the day that we were there, they had 45 cats in the shelter and 26 dogs. And so if you compare that to the capacity, they were in fact very close to capacity, but certainly not over capacity. And I think we need to have our staff members who are responsible for each of the areas to be doing this on a daily basis. And this doesn't require any calculations. All I have to do is look around. Am I setting up some temporary housing because I can't house the animals I have? Are we having to euthanize animals? And what proportion of animals are we having to euthanize because we can't house them? Of course, it's never quite that simple because if you just go around and count humane housing units, the question is for whom? You may have 29 cages or housing units for dogs, but there may be 10 of those that are suitable only for small dogs. And what if you're thinking about large dogs? So these capacity assessments have to be done with in mind the types of animals that you usually see. Do you usually get a lot of larger dogs? What do you have the capacity? What's your capacity for larger dogs? What's your capacity for kittens? How many kittens? We obviously put more kittens from a litter in a cage. How many cages do you have that can house litters? And so historically, you need to go back and figure out, well, last year, how many litters did we have? Your best estimate of what you're going to have this coming year is what happened last year, unless there's something really different happening in your community. You've just had a big housing unit, and your human population has just jumped 10% in the last year. I mean, you have to do this all with in mind what is actually happening in your own community. Okay? But in this particular shelter, while they were overall under capacity, they in fact had 15 large dogs for 11 double-sided. So they now had some of their double-sided runs for dogs doubled up. And so they were over capacity in the large dog areas. So to be most useful, you really want to look at each of the areas you have in your shelter and think about it in terms of age groups. Does this take some time? Yeah, it does. You're going to have to invest some time and effort if you really want to do this. But I think you will find that once you start doing it and get people to thinking about monitoring it, and again, if you have people in specific areas helping you do the monitoring just by looking. Today, we don't have any room, or today we have 3 open cages. I think you can do it by area in your shelter. All right, here's just a look at, this was a shelter over time where in fact they were fine. This is overall now, this is not by age groups or anything, but they were under capacity in the early part of the year. But look what happened when kitten season hit. They just ballooned up. And so what we were this is the actual physical capacity of the shelter. So beginning sometime around May every year and ending sometime in December, they were over capacity. And they had cages everywhere. And cats with cats, on cats, and more cats. So what we did was set the goal, is we're going to try to drop the capacity, and part of the way we're going to do that is shorten length of stay in these shelters. And you can see that with time, we were able to start to drive that down. And I don't have, I got to get this updated, but they're now just slightly above capacity in 2011 and 2012. They're no longer above capacity. Another way of looking at it is you could look at over the last year, what was your average daily capacity? This was the physical capacity. How many, on average, animals did you have in the shelter? And then what was the average daily percent capacity that you were running at, noticing that in July and August you were actually over capacity. And remember that average is only the measure of somewhere around the center of the data. And it doesn't tell you, well, okay, how many days were you actually over capacity? It just tells you on average you were over capacity. So actually tallying the number of days that you had more animals than you could comfortably house gives you some sense of the chronicity of being over capacity within your shelter. Is this the only way you can look at it? Of course not. There are all kinds of ways. But I think this is one way that's made sense to us, and we've explained it to shelters, and they go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize half of those months we were over capacity. And this is just physical capacity. And then, if you think about it, it's not just physical capacity, it's the capacity of managing animals over time, or housing animals over time. So that has to do with how many housing units, how many days. So if I've got 30 humane housing units, and I have 30 days, I have 900 cage spaces to play with in 1 month. That's 30 days long. Does that make sense to you? 30 cages, and I've got 30 days. So I've got 900 cage spaces that I could occupy. And what happens in most shelters, in our experience, is that they haven't really thought about it, that they just do it. But in fact, you can actually think about it and then take some steps to help manage the use of that cage space. If you want to think about it as a kind of currency, how am I going to spread out 900 cage days? Among how many animals can I spread that out and actually provide good care? So one way to do that is to use this formula. And the formula talks about the number of housing units that you have, the number of days that you have in the period you're thinking about, how long animals stay in your shelter during that period, and that will give you the number of animals you can comfortably house. Or you can work backwards. You can look at the number of cats that you could house and contemplate what average length of stay you'd need during that 30-day period to comfortably house them without running over capacity. This formula you need to play with. And I've got it listed, but on the Davis website, they have a nice little calculator. They call it adoption-driven capacity calculator. And it'll work for capacity or adoption capacity. You just have to have these pieces of information. Now, the only thing I would say is that this average length of stay is not the one that's based on intake or outcome. This average length of stay is the one that talks about, on average, among all the animals that were in the shelter, what was their average length of stay. And to get that, you can get the daily census. All the animals that were in the shelter on June 1, June 2, June 3, June 4, add them all up, and that will give you the total number of cage days that were occupied in your shelter during that period. Divide that by the number of animals that were either present on day 1 or came in during that interval, because those are the ones that you actually housed, and you can calculate your average length of stay that would be useful for capacity estimates. That's something, incidentally, the notes that I gave to the people are a little outdated. I revised these a little bit, so I'm going to at the end give you my email. If you want copies of what I have, I will be happy to send them to you. Just send me an email and say, hey, I'd like a copy of the revised. They're not tremendously different than what I gave you, but they are somewhat different. I think a little clearer than what I had before. And so there are a lot of things, and we're getting short on time, and I really want to give you a few minutes for questions. So these are the kinds of questions you could ask. And these are just a few of the many questions you could ask using those formulas. And what I've done is I have given you the results of how to do that on the following slides, because we're going to run out of time. Just want you to recognize that there are some assumptions in using this. That roughly your intake and outflow are roughly the same if you're going to use these capacity estimates. That the intakes and outflows are fairly regularly dispersed across the interval. Because if most of your animals come in around the first of the month, obviously you're going to have some problems, because you're going to have more animals than you have cages to take care of them, even though you've used this formula and it seems to work out. Does that make sense? So you're kind of assuming that there's going to be a fairly regular influx and outflow across the system. And I've already mentioned to you, they're technically, it really ought to be normally distributed. This will still work. We've played with some of the data, and it will still work even if you use averages and they aren't. So I'm going to move through these. These are just using the same formulas that I showed you, only using them to illustrate to you how you could use the formulas to help you get the numbers that you need. So I'm not going to talk about these. Just a quick moment about adoption-driven. You can do this for each area in your shelter. And I think that's the most helpful to do it in, because as we saw earlier, you can do an overall capacity, you look fine, but in fact your kitten room is just overflowing. So to be most helpful, I think you need to monitor it at the area level. Just a quick word on staffing capacity. This came out of the Humane Society of the United States recommendations that, staff that's providing basic care, that is cleaning, feeding, perhaps having to move animals within the shelter, should be providing at least 15 minutes per day for basic care. And this is from a shelter that we were working with where we looked at the staff that provided basic care, looked at their total number of hours. This was on a weekly basis, so this was the total hours that they spent per week providing basic care. We then said, well, okay, if that's for a week, then per day they had 26.4 hours to devote to animal care. On the day we were there, they had 79 animals. So that in fact, they had, at least theoretically, and these are all estimates, right? They're only as good as the data you put into them. So that's why you want to try to be as accurate as you can. You're using them as a guideline. But in fact, this shelter was within those minimal amount of time that you would have to spend for an animal per day. Yes? So my understanding of this is that it is what's included is the cleaning, so it's mostly the kennel staff and those that are responsible for feeding and watering. It does not include medical care staff. You'd have to do your own staffing capacity for medical care. It doesn't include the adoption staff. So you'd have to, again, compartmentalize and start looking at those. That's my understanding. Anybody have a different understanding? That is what I understand. Okay. All right. And then we've already talked about all of these. I just want to spend 1 minute or two, because I really wanted to have some time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about disease. Disease threatens the welfare of animals in your shelter. Sick animals suffer. Make no mistake. Even the respiratory infection in an adult cat, that animal isn't feeling well. And if we can prevent that animal from getting sick, we not only make that animal feel better, but we also minimize the likelihood that they spread it to another animal. Okay? So, what I'd like you to think about is setting goals that have to do with the medical health of the population of animals in the shelter. And we're pushing our veterinarians to begin to think this way. To say, what proportion of the cats that walked through the door in June got sick with upper respiratory? And notice I'm saying got sick. And you can choose all kinds of you can use Panlug, but I'm going to pick on upper respiratory because that's the bane of all of our existences in terms of medical issues. And so you could make a very specific plan that over this next year, we are going to, or I'm going to use this example I have, in this summer, we're going to try to reduce the upper respiratory tract infections, the rate of upper respiratory tract infections in our cats by 5%. And we're going to, I'm not going to talk about how to do it, but you would develop a very specific plan as how you're going to do that. And what we really like to know is what was the rate last year so that we can decide whether we've made any progress this year. So in order to do that, we would need to get you need to define your time frame, because always when you're looking at risk of developing something, you're talking about a specific time frame. Within what time frame? So June, July, August, September. You then count the animals that get sick during that interval. If they were sick at the beginning of the interval, they were already in your infirmary, you don't care about those. They're not at risk of getting sick. They're already sick. Okay? And technically, you would want to count the animals that entered the shelter with no URI. Because if they came in with URI, they're not going to get URI while they're there. Technically. I mean, if you've got a very small proportion and that you can't pull those, that goes to can we get the data back out of the database. But technically, you'd like to pull them out. And then you're going to, the denominator has to be all those that come into the shelter during that time frame, plus those that were already there that weren't already sick. That's an incidence rate. That's the probability of getting sick during that interval. We have the capability, I mean, the data are there. It's the question of how to extract that data to get us to that point. And I've just gone ahead and done an example for you. 665 entered, 27 were ill, 100 were in the shelter. On July 1 of these, 15 were in the infirmary. We take this away from that, this away from 100, add them together. These are the 723 that were at risk. And during those months, 123 of those cats got sick. So the incidence of 17%. So the probability when you walk through that door of you getting sick, if you were a cat coming into that shelter, was 17%. Okay? Now you have a number against which to assess whether you drop that 3%, right? This doesn't, I mean, you can do it with software, but actually your veterinarians could do it without software. All they'd have to do, they could go to the software packages and get the intake data. They can go to the census, which most of the programs provide by day for the first day of that interval, add those together, you have the population at risk. It's true you may not be able to extract those that already had URI, but if you did it consistently over time, you could actually now, and your veterinarian was counting, on this day I diagnosed 3 new cases. On this day I diagnosed 4 new cases. That's not a lot of work. I mean, it should be in the database, but if that's too onerous for them, then write it down in a book. Even if you just started counting cases, I don't know how many shelters we've been in who don't know. They know they have a lot of URI. They don't know how much. Just starting to quantify that will help you to assess how you're doing. So the rest of it is just going to reinforce, the rest of it is kind of summary of reinforcing you have quality data, right? You have to have quality data. It has to be as complete as possible. So that means training your people as to what is the importance of collecting good, complete data. Showing them how you're using the data to improve the quality of health of the animals in the shelter, or tracking how your intake's doing with your spay-neuter programs, how you're doing with your live release proportion. Good definitions, what constitutes a URI? Who gets to decide whether this is actually URI, a sneezing cat who just doesn't really have a URI? If you do that, you have a lot of good data. And then the question is how to get it out. And that's the $64,000 question. Much of this we got out of, we happen to be using PetPoint because the shelters around us use PetPoint. Much of this we got out of PetPoint from the regular reports. You have to work at it a little bit. And especially if you're going to do it historically and do it for all the months, oftentimes you have to run one monthly for the report for January, then the report for February. And I'd love to see PetPoint actually automate some of this where you could actually get a count of all of those. And I think maybe with Report Builder you could do it. It takes a little bit of work to get to know how to use Report Builder. But if you did it every month, once you got started with it, you don't have to do 1 month at a time, right? Because you've already done all the months before that. Census data. A lot of the software packages can tell you, what's your census on January 1? What's your census? What was your census on January 2? So that data are already there so that you can get the estimates of cage days that you used in the month of June or the month of July. There's and I've forgotten the time, status reports. Is it status? stage reports. That's right. I knew it started with an S. Stage reports where you can actually get time in a particular stage. This is from PetPoint. And I can't speak. I know there are a lot of other software packages. But you can get stage, so you can get time in particular events from that. So a good amount of what I've talked, and if your veterinarians are entering data in PetPoint at least, you can count the number of new cases. They have to be using it, they have to be putting it in accurately, but you can do that. So most everything I've talked about today, you can do with PetPoint. I'm not as familiar with the other, it may take a little work to get it. The other thing I would say, I mean, we talked about, should we start talking more about metrics to you folks when you can't really do it easily? But you guys are the ones who can put pressure on software packages. Say, I want this kind of information. It's not going to come from us. It's going to come from you folks as users saying, we really want this information. The other thing is that you saw I used a lot of, these are just Excel graphs. I would bet money that most of you have somebody on your staff who knows how to use Excel and to do graphing. Graphing is not difficult to do. And once you get started, we just recently did a consult on a shelter. I just took some of their data and entered it while my colleagues were doing other things, and then gave them a start over the last 3 or 4 years. I gave them the intake data, outcome data, et cetera. So once you get started, you only have to enter it a month at a time or a week at a time, depending on who you have do it. So that takes a lot of the time element out of it. And then there are ways to automate, just to update your graph. You don't have to create a whole new graph. You just need to update that graph. And if you yourselves don't have staff members, talk to your kids. Or get somebody from the local high school. They know how to use Excel. So it's not hard. And I like the visualization. I really like the visualization. As you can see, it's harder to look at a bunch of data on a table. It's much easier to look at a trend, something where there's a visual impact, by putting it in visual form. Plus, it's more interesting. You're going to get your board members, you're going to get your public, your donors, whatever. They can understand it more easily if you have it in a visual form. Even I, who work with numbers a lot, prefer to see something visually. I'm just a more visual person. So now that I have run over, other questions? I know we probably have just a few minutes for some questions before somebody comes with a hook. Yes?
One of the metrics, or one of the things that we tried, you didn't talk about it here, but that we sometimes use are these estimates of pet populations. Like
Yes.
how many dogs or cats or
Yes. Yes.
I've looked at a lot of various formulas for doing this, and one thing that I don't see as a factor in figuring out estimates is the actual number of animals going into the shelter system. And that seems like one of the few true barometers you have of an actual measurable result to incorporate into a formula. Are you familiar with any that do use that? Or?
No, I don't. And I don't. I'm going to guess that it doesn't, because it's so variable by community how many shelters actually serve that community. So, for example, in Tompkins County, we have one shelter who serves Tompkins County. So that might be a good barometer. Even there, though, we don't know what proportion of animals of all those owned actually come into the shelter. We could estimate it with the very formulas that you talk about. But if you take a large metropolitan area where there may be 30 shelters, or let's just say 15 shelters, if you had data from, even if you had data from each of them, which you often don't have, you don't know what proportion of animals actually in that community are brought into the shelter. So backtracking and estimating how many animals there were in the community is very difficult. We don't have good data. We just don't know. Does that make sense to you?
It does. I was just wondering if it could be a factor, not the factor.
I think, well, yeah. I mean, if we had a better understanding of what proportion of animals are using shelters, yeah, we could use it. Yeah, you're right, because it's better data than essentially any other source within the community. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Going back a few slides, you talked about taking the staffing and averaging
Good question. What we're doing here is looking at whether or not, oh, repeat the question, sorry, I've asked it. So the question, no, that was for me. He was telling me I needed to repeat the question because they're videoing this. So the question was, how do you factor into that staffing capacity the role of volunteers? And the answer is you don't. And the rationale behind that is, not to say you couldn't, but the rationale behind that is that volunteers come and go. They may not be stable in a lot of shelters. They may be seasonal only. And what you want to be sure to have is sufficient staff to provide.
That's a baseline. Anything else?
Yeah, is gravy on top of that.
That's kind of your minimum.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So your hope, I mean, it's not like saying you're under capacity doesn't mean necessarily that you're not providing good care, because you might be picking it up in other ways. Yeah. So it's just a measure of where you are. And again, you know what I really don't like is to compare one shelter to another. You know, to say, oh, well, they're under capacity, under staffing capacity, and this we're not. Because that may or may not be indicative of what is actually being provided to the animals. So I really don't like comparing one shelter to another. I do like comparing one shelter to itself over time and how it's progressing. Others? Other questions? Thank you. I apologize for being a little bit over.